Kara Swisher, she is back. Guy, this is the 5th time that she has been on a Risk
Stop
Reversal
it.
Media podcast. You are listening to OK Computer. She is Kara Swisher. She's the host of On. She's the host of Pivot. And she just wrote The Burn Book. We have it right here. I just read it. It's a tech love story, isn't it, Kara?
Yes, that's what it is. It's a love gone wrong. It's as many loves do, right?
Well, I mean, listen, I read this book.
It's like the Taylor Swift of textbooks, you know what I mean? Tech books. So.
Well, she's riding that all the way to being a billionaire. So maybe that's what you've got in store for you here a little bit. But Guy and I, listen, I really love this book. You know, Guy and I have like an interesting seat because, you know, we've had a front row seat for a lot of things that you detail in this book, but from a different perspective in a way. And so
I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, but I'd like to start at the end. And again, because you said the journey started as a love story, and despite your many disappointments, it remains one. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to kind of end this book with. And so, you know, your coverage has broadened out like way beyond tech, right? It's policy, it's regulation, it's ethics, it's morality, and you've turned into a really important voice, which means opinion too. So talk to us a little bit about this. You know what I mean? What do you still love about technology? And that's my William Miller question. That's the last question that he asked at the end of Almost Famous.
That's a long question, but let me try to like take that apart. It's my memoir is really, if you think about it like a memoir. And again, like when I said I'd like to hear your viewpoint, this is my viewpoint of what happened. Now, a lot of people will be like, I don't think that's what it was like. And I was like, well, that's what it was like for me. And this is my observations of a lot of these big figures through the lens of my journey through them over my career, which has been very varied, actually. And so the evolution of my career is a little bit like the evolution of tech, you know, going from a regular mainstream reporting kind of career to a much more entrepreneurial one, shifting into someone who was sort of pioneering the idea of reported analysis. And I don't mean punditry, I mean actual reporting, and then coming to a conclusion, which is everywhere now. You know, every Substack is doing what All Things D did many years ago, right? Here's what happened at Comcast. Now let us tell you what it means, you know, and I think people find that valuable. Trying new mediums, like moving into podcasting. I was quite early to that. Even doing All Things D was very early, and you see it iterated everywhere. And so the idea is like, what were these people like when they started? What happened? And then what did we end up with, and what did they become? So I joke about it, Taylor Swift at Tech Books, but I actually kind of like that idea. It's like, I had this boyfriend and he's not all that, or he is all that, or he didn't get me, or look what happened to him. And, you know, it's a story. It really is a story more than anything else. It's a story of one person's journey through these people. And then there's lots of history. There's a ton of internet history here. And it's easy history. It's not like I don't do it in the techie way. I'm like, this happened, and then this led to this, and then this led to this. And so if you just are interested in that development, that's fine too. So that was
Kara,
make it easy to read.
How do you back in, and to the extent that you do back in, you're prolific in everything you do. Do you say, okay, this is the goal of a book I want to write, and then you solve to that goal? Or you sort of sit down and start writing and then say, here's what the goal of the book is going to be. I'm curious.
Well, you know, interestingly, I am 2 years late on this book. It was due more than 2 years ago. And I really dragged my feet on it. I didn't want to do it. And John Karp was my original editor at the first AOL book I wrote in 1997, I think it was. And he was a young editor at Crown Books, and I was a young reporter. And he's the one that pushed me to write about AOL. I was going to write about something else. And he had bothered me over the years to do, you know, what's going on, Kara? What's happening here? And I had resisted you didn't see a Twitter book from me. You didn't see a Google book from me. And I was the one covering most of that and breaking much of the news on a lot of those companies, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, or people that worked for me. And I just didn't want to write those books, right? Like, what happened to Google? How did they, you know, and all the details. And I resisted and resisted and resisted. And even till today, where I get like 9 offers to write an AI book. Now that's the latest trends, or a crypto book or whatever. That was 2 years ago, whatever. And he came to me and said, you should write this as fiction. And that intrigued me. I was like, I can finally kill one of these people and get away with it. And I thought about that. And I thought, no, let me just tell it like fiction. Like, let me tell the nonfiction like fiction. And so the way to do it is through the journey of my career. And he very much leaned into, and I resisted writing about myself a lot. I was like, well, who cares about me? Like, they care about Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. But he really thought it was an important way to talk about someone's sort of the scales falling off someone's eyes, I guess, if that's the journey.
All right, hold on a second. Stop for 1 second, because you just said something that I find fascinating. Who cares about me is what you just said. And I know you mean that sincerely. But if you think about it, if you take a step back and look at your life and look at your career, I mean, why wouldn't people care? I mean, think about where you are.
If you're interested in media, if you're interested in development of media, I am an interesting figure. I'm talking about, I'm one of those people who doesn't think media is as interesting as media thinks media is. You know what I mean? Like, media can go on and on about all the machinations. And I don't think regular people care. It's like, nobody cares about how the inside of the insurance industry works either. You know, I mean, they just care about the outcome. And here's where I do think it's interesting. The first quote I use a lot of quotes in the book, was from The Great Gatsby. I am that character. I am the one hanging around Gatsby. That's who I am. And it's actually the scales fell off his eyes, right? But he still loved what happened. And at the same time, he chronicled destruction, right? And so that's who I am, I think, if I had to pick a character.
No, look, Kara, that's fair. But, in hanging around Gatsby, that person became a character unto
100%.
himself. And, you were a character when I say character, I mean that, by the way, extraordinarily complimentary. Long before you met any of these people, I mean, you were destined to be a really interesting person. So there are a lot of reporters or journalists that I don't give a shit about anything in their personal lives or what their arc is. But you got to admit, Kara, you're a little bit different than that.
Yeah, I think I've done because I've become entrepreneurial. And that's the good thing I took away from doing this beat. I was by nature entrepreneurial, and it brought it out in me. I think certain people are more entrepreneurial than others. I had the reporter's quality of being questioning of everything is a good entrepreneurial quality, right? Like, why do we do it that way? Can't we do it this way? They can see around corners. And I don't think they actually see around corners. What they say is, why are we doing it this way? And I did that for media. I absolutely, again, there's no question when you look around today, everything that is being done and touted as fresh and new. We did it All Things D. You know that, right? You saw it, all the funny things, the weird videos, the handheld cameras. Everyone's like, look, handheld cameras. I'm like, we did that with the Pure, what was it called? The Pure, that video camera and then he's now ambassador to Singapore, the guy who did it. Pure Digital.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Pure Digital handheld cameras. This is pre-iPhone having cameras in them. We did all kinds of personality journalism, really. And then we did the live journalism at Code. And before that, All Things D conference. That was groundbreaking. There's no question what we were doing from the media point of view was groundbreaking. And then switching into podcasting so early was unusual. It just was. And now every VC with a
any dummy can do it. I've told you in the past that I think Decode was one of my first. It was the first podcast I ever listened to. I think it was back in 2015. It was really very much an inspiration for what Guy and I are doing right now. Kara, like taking a step back. Really.
Except you guys are qualified. You talk about things. Let me just say, there's a lot of people that just yammer on. I don't particularly want to hear what any VC thinks about the Ukraine unless they're invested there. You guys talk about things you know about, which is, I think, very helpful to listeners. That's always that's sort of my North Star of any podcast.
That's the goal. I mean, listen, we think of ourselves as a bit more of the ephemeral guys, largely because the markets are open Monday through Friday. They're active between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. and we have a lot of experience.
That's correct.
We don't get everything right, but we try to be very transparent and honest. And that is a common thread throughout the different periods in which you were reporting on tech. And it's really interesting. So let's take a step back, okay? So when I started in the business in the mid 90s, which is right around the same time you started covering the internet, I was the youngest guy on a trading desk, and they looked at me and they said, figure out what AOL, YHOO, what XCIT, figure out what these things do, because they are moving around a lot and we see a lot of opportunity to trade them. And so it's interesting. That's how I found out about you when you started covering that beat, because traditional media, at least the business media, didn't really know how to cover stocks like that at the time. So what you were doing was putting faces is to some of the names of these really generally young, like males, you know what I mean? And what these big visions were. And it really helped, I think it helped me understand a little bit about what was going on.
There was nobody there. There really wasn't covering this stuff. There were a few reporters, but it was, John Markoff was around, but he was covering computers and software at Microsoft particularly, and Apple, but that was a different era. The computer software hardware era was different than the internet, and there was the internet shifted it rather profoundly, because the computer mattered but didn't, right? That you had to have one, obviously, but what mattered more was Wi-Fi networks and bringing it all together. And so it required a different kind of reporter. And in the book, I talk about what my theory was I'm telling you the time, not what's in the watch. Who cares what's in the watch? It doesn't matter anymore. It's like understanding what the implications of a car without understanding an engine. You don't need to understand an engine to understand the impact of the car on American society in lots of ways. And so that was my goal. There was a lot of techies covering this stuff, very tech oriented people, and chips and things like that. And as important as those things are, and they are absolutely, see NVIDIA, it was not important. What was important about it is what it was going to impact, whether it was sports or communications or commerce. And I think I did bring that to it. I cared about the tech in as much as what it would do. And that was different from other reporters. And there was nobody there. That's why they all saw me, because nobody was paying attention to them. They really weren't, except for the money. Then when the money started to be made, you had all the Wall Street people going, this is a Ponzi scheme, and some of it was, by the way.
Well, a lot of it was in 1.0. It wasn't as much of a Ponzi. It was just built on really shaky foundations. But this was one of the things that, again, I found really interesting. And, the book talks about that you are a student of history, and you apply that knowledge to a lot of the stuff that you're looking at and reporting on, and it gives you some sort of framework. But this quote was really interesting to me. I've determined where tech goes depends on who makes the decisions. This book is about those decision makers and your ability to kind of flesh them out in a way. Talk to us a little bit about that, because, Web 1.0, some of those folks made it into 2.0, but the, 100 billionaires today, you know what I mean, are very different than some of the pioneers of the 90s. And so talk about those decision makers.
I mean, first there were the sort of the people that like put together the internet itself. Like those people were different. There were tons of companies like that. I talked about Bill Schrader, I think, who had I keep blanking. Oh God, blanking everything. It's so long ago. But there were a lot of people, the internet service providers that just, that's who hooked you up. And that was a very different thing. That was much like which had come before. But what happened later was the commercialization and the consumerization. And I think that's why AOL was so attractive to me. It just happened to be out in Vienna, Virginia, and I worked at the Washington Post. And most of the stuff the Post covered in tech were consolidators for the government, contractors and things like that would put in giant government data systems, whether it was the Social Security or the IRS. And I did not write about that. Like, who cares? Like, in that, for me, who cares? And this new thing was happening, and it was not called the internet. It was called online services, if you recall at the time. And David Ignatius was became the head of the business section at the time. And he intuitively understood this was different. And he's like, young person, go out there. You know what I mean? You get it. You know how to use this and that. And I already had displayed an interest in mobile phones. I was obsessed with our Washington Post one. I was really interested in mobile phones, and I saw them immediately as a game changer, right? You could see that everything, if you looked around, you could make the connections that if everyone had a mobile phone, they wouldn't have a desk phone. They wouldn't be in the office. And I would do things like that and sit there. And there was a teletype machine, that in a newsroom, the old the news doesn't come through until it's typed on one of those idiotic typewriters, essentially. And we had one at the Post, right at the front of the Post. And I looked at it, and everyone, it's a very delightful, romantic version of a newspaper. The reporters run to it and then pull it off and then look at it. And I was like, what the hell do you need that for if you have the internet? And they're like, that's the newspaper. I was like, you don't need that. You don't need that. Why are you tearing off a piece of paper? And I used to wander around being such an irritating young person. And my whole premise once I went to see AOL was, everyone's going to have access to every piece of information. And it was a series of knowledge. Like, I went to Duke and I downloaded a book. And the tech person didn't get it, but I did. I was like, oh, then you don't need a book. If you can put it in a digital format, and then that digital format becomes like a book, what do you need and then I thought trees, I know it sounds dumb, but it iterated through my mind all the industries that we affected. And most importantly, the one I worked in. So when I saw Craigslist, I was like, curtains, fucking curtains for the Washington Post, because I had covered retail before that. And I'd watched as all the retailers in Washington died, Garfinkel's, all these retailers that Heckinger, if you remember them, they were actually, I think that was a public stock. And that was one of their businesses. So brand advertising, display advertising was dying in the physical newspaper. Walmart didn't advertise and was highly technical. That's how they figured out how to get people. Craigslist was going to kill classifieds, and free news was going to kill the subscription. And I was like, oh my God, and everyone was wandering around taking stuff off the teletype machine. And I was like, Pompeii, that volcano looks kind of scary. Like, I think it's going to blow. And then they'd be caught, they'd be stuck in lava. You ever go to Pompeii? It's cool.
Yeah. Yes.
Isn't it cool? They just were like eating dinner, and then they were like,
but
then they were there. They it covered them. And I don't know. I find that really interesting. Like that there's a couple of them where they're just like, anyway, that's how I thought. Pompeii had a big effect on me. I was like, oh, look, Pompeii, it's coming. So.
Well, speaking of having a big effect, unless you're a complete sociopath, which there are a lot of those people running around, everybody is riddled with self-doubt. I don't care how successful, wealthy, whatever word you want to use, but it's pretty clear that Walt Mossberg had a huge impact on your life. And, that's evident in the beginning of the book, the dedication. So speak to the importance of him and the importance of mentorship.
Well, I can't say enough about Walt Mossberg. What a fine person, right? He was, and he walked me down the aisle at my wedding. My dad died, and he was, so I'll put that in there. But more than that, here's someone. And one of the things I noticed when I was also a news post, and I delivered mail. Really successful people, for the most part, were nice to me. Less successful people were not. It was a real learning experience. The real jerks were the less talented people, not in every case, but often. It's kind of interesting. And his generosity of his spirit was critically important. And he mentored so many people, and a lot of women. Like, that was unusual for at the time. And one of the things that I got from him, and I met him through writing the AOL book, because he was the one that called it. He said, hey, forget CompuServe and Prodigy, which were backed by big backers. Prodigy was Sears and IBM, if you remember. And CompuServe was big. It was more geeky, but it was very big. He picked AOL out, and I was struck by that because I agreed with him. And every time he wrote something, I'm like, that guy knows what he's talking about, right? So I introduced myself to him. We went to lunch. We had French dips at this restaurant that doesn't exist in Washington. I remember the food. And he and I just had this mind meld instantly. And we couldn't understand why newspaper companies and media companies didn't get it. And we talked about that a lot. And I was riveted to these companies, and he was a great reporter. That was the critical thing. Is one thing Walt Mossberg did was he reported, and then he said what he thought. And that was powerful, right? And so people really trusted him. The second thing he did was that he made a fortune for the Wall Street Journal, because every Thursday, everyone had to turn to that column, and then all the advertisers were there. So he was also a moneymaker, right, for the paper, and was paid accordingly, by the way, and deservedly. And so to me, he was a new form of influencer, right? He's the original influencer, if you think about them today, but it was a trusted influencer. And that's, he didn't just mouth off. He did the work, and then he told you, and people liked that. And the best part is he liked some things and he didn't like. He wasn't one of those fanboys slavishly loving everything, nor was he a snarky asshole who was like, tech sucks. Like, he didn't say that, right? And so he helped me and got me a job. He was also in his own interest. He wanted someone at the Wall Street Journal who understood it and did it well. And he got me the job at the Wall Street Journal. And then later, when I got very frustrated with the print publication, he and I used our ideas about conferences and blogs together, because we had the same viewpoint. So it was a real kismet for me to be, and he's such a high quality individual. I can't even, the ethics, it was always me trying to race ahead, and Walt's being like ethically much, I don't mean non-ethics, but like I'd be like, Howard Stern should come to All Things D. And he's like, Howard Stern is homophobic and, whatever. I'm like, I don't care, and I'm the gay, homophobic and misogynistic at the time. If you remember, he had some hair on him, Howard Stern did. Yeah. And so it was a great partnership in that way. It was a real push-pull, and we made a ton of money too. So
it's interesting. So Guy mentioned it was the dedication. It was also the first acknowledgement, and I was one of those people who it was a must-read every Thursday. And I did appreciate his honesty, because we all knew, a lot of people thought he was always like kind of holding water for Apple, but he would come out and he would eviscerate an Apple product every so often. And I remember after Jobs' death, I think he wrote about it a little bit, some of the experiences that he had where Steve picked up the phone and called him as soon as, like, you know what I mean?
Did.
And there's a lot of great Job stuff, and we'll save that for a little bit later, because let
me tell you something. He was supposed to write a memoir. Walt was. That was one of the reasons I did, because he didn't. He had a book contract and he just decided not to. As to the holding water thing, it's the most valuable company in the world. There's a reason for it, because their products are better. They just are. So that's why I liked him, because he's stuck with it. He's like, I like it. You can say I'm holding water for them, but they're still better. Yeah. And by the way, he would have been real tough on the Vision Pro, I suspect. I don't know.
I think so. But again, to your point, he's been proven right, because look at like they have 90% of the gross margin in the smartphone industry. You know what I mean? Right. This is 15 years after they invented the game. So I agree with that. Here was one thing that I thought was really interesting, because again, and Guy mentioned this, your relationship with him, it spans through the course of the book here. There's just a couple different anecdotes in the middle, and I thought this was really interesting. So after you were going to go out in the late 90s to cover the internet sector after being in DC, he said, parachute in with your cleats on. They'll never know what hit them. Be fair, but cover them hard, since they are going to run the world. Okay, so talk to me a little bit about that, because that's kind of what you did, Kara, over the last 25 years.
That's exactly. I listen to whatever Walt says. I do. He's like, he's like, Sarge, go in, private, and and I was like, yes, Sarge, kind of thing. He was right. He really did see it. I was aware of where it was going too, but he really understood. You had to be a bit of an analyst, a bit of a predict, a sort of a Nostradamus to see it. But once you saw it, you ever know those pictures? There's one on the internet right now of a duck swimming, and if it's going the wrong direction, you don't see it. But if you look at it right, you're like, oh, I see the face. Oh, I see where it's going. And so he really wanted. I think in a lot of ways, Walt lived in Washington because he wanted to be away from these people, right? While he fairly covered their stuff. And I thought that was the right decision. But he wanted someone there that would hold them to account, because a holding to account was a big thing of Walt's, right? If you do something bad, you pay for it, right? If you get called out. And so he wanted a reporter there who would not want to be their friends, who would also not be necessarily negative, if something was good, who would just assess the situation and report back honestly. And that's what he wanted. And so he got me the job at the Wall Street Journal, got Paul Steiger to hire me. And they needed someone, by the way, who knew these people. And there wasn't anyone who knew them but me, right? Because I had met them writing the book on AOL. And some people did, but it was a very small group of people. I mean, I can't even remember. There was one reporter who was there who I competed with quite a bit in the early days, but not many. And at the Journal, it wasn't that welcome among the reporters there, as I related in the book.
Kara, you said in the book, I've spent my career being hard on powerful people. With great power comes great responsibility. Absolutely. Who's lived up to that mantle in your estimation? I'm sure you've met people that, he or she gets it.
Yeah, I think everybody has their flaws. Not everyone's been perfect the whole time, but I think some people understand the responsibility. And some people, look, here's the reason why the first line of the book was capitalism after all. I still think they're capitalists. Doesn't matter. I wanted to say that because no industry, except for this one, has to do so much performative bullshit about who they are. We're changing the world. We're community. The whole thing, we're here to bring world peace, whatever nonsense they spew. Everything they do has to do with making more money or growing their businesses. They're the Borg. They're relentless in their growth obsession. And that's why they're so big, right? It's not because they're good people or anything else. So I'm not expecting goodness from them. But if they have responsibility and they do things, I don't want them to pretend that they didn't cause damage they did, right? And I don't want them to lean in and say, we gave you Facebook and therefore we get off on all the negative parts. I mean, look, you saw today there was a terrible article in the Washington Post about Instagram and mothers helping their daughters put up all these cheesecake shots. And so I wanted them to understand what they were making. If they were making it, they had to have some level of safety around what they were doing. And so the people who got it, nobody perfectly, including myself. I always point to Brian Chesky, although lots of controversy around Airbnb, but he answers the question. Like when things happen, he responds, he does something, he changes it. He just, after years of me bugging him, they just are starting to change the cleaning fees, at least transparency around cleaning. It sounds dumb, but like, stop pretending you're not cheating. You're not cheating people. It's just, it was, in order to make just people didn't know it, or safety in those places. There's never going to be totally safe, because if you're renting your house out to someone, on both sides of the equation, there's going to be a problem somewhere. So I like how he approaches it. I really enjoyed watching the evolution of Mark Cuban, who I think has become, if you remember him back in the day, I don't remember if you do, Dan, but he was quite a piece of work. Yep. And at the time he sold broadcast.com to Yahoo, that was just such a pig in a poke. Come on. Like, it was a good idea, but come on, for the money, he said. And I think I said that and he got all mad at me. I was like, come on, that was the best, shoplifting in history I've ever seen, because he sold the stock right away. That he was so prescient about it. And he didn't talk to me for a while. And of course I was, come on. Like, I didn't care that he did it. That was Yahoo's board that did that, not me. But he's evolved in a really interesting way and sort of understood the responsibility. Not perfect. He screams and yells. I know he's had all kinds of wrangles with startup people. I don't expect perfection and all goodness from these people in any way, but I do expect what I like is an evolution of their personalities and their responsibilities. I think Apple does a pretty good job at it, and for the most part, not perfect. The stuff in China's, they've definitely made very severe compromises there to do business there. And what I think about China. So, or not the Chinese people, the Chinese government. And everyone is different. I think the evolution of Bill Gates, let's leave the Epstein stuff out of it for this second, because nothing's been proven with him there. But I think he's been an interesting character, going from Darth Vader to doing some really significant stuff in philanthropy and vaccines and climate change. Very interesting evolution of a person. So
better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. And so I say that because I think the first time you met Zuckerberg, he said to you something like, I heard you thought I'm an asshole.
Yeah, I don't know where he got that.
And I think you said to him, no, I thought you probably were. But did he remove all doubt when you met him?
He's not an asshole. He's not. No, he doesn't talk a lot. You know that. He does now. Now he's like blibbity blabbity. If you notice that, all of a sudden he's like, let me make a video. I think it comes with evolution. I do appreciate when he does his barbecue ones and his MMA. I find that somewhat charming, or his hydrofoiling, whatever the hell he's doing with that. But no, I don't think he's an asshole at all. I've never thought that. I thought he was he tried to be thoughtful, but I think he is the problem I have with him. And I wrote a column in the New York Times, my first one. I called it The Expensive Education of Mark Zuckerberg. And I meant at our expense, not his. And I thought a lot of stuff he was doing, he didn't know what he was doing and he did it anyway. And that was an issue for me. And I don't think it was out of malevolence by any stretch. I just think he had a very weak education in terms of what the implications of things he would do. And that famous interview I did with, not the sweating one, about Alex Jones and then the Holocaust deniers was a perfect example. I was like, anti-Semitism on this platform is running rampant. And if you keep doing it, it's going to have real world implications. Because anti-Semitism has been a plague on our world since the beginning times. It's not a new thing, but you have amplified it. And he took 2 years to get them off the platform and still had a problem doing that, and here we are, if anyone wonders why it's worse than ever, I can show you some posts on Facebook.
Well, so here's one that I just absolutely loved. And there's a lot of stuff in this book that, again, I've been listening to your pods. I talk to you personally. I read your stuff. There's a lot of stuff in this book that some of your loyal followers have never heard before and never seen before. And that's what's really exciting. And I loved this one. I've heard iterations of this from you, but the prick to productivity ratio. This is a unscientific formula that you have used throughout your career to kind of take stock of people, to take stock of situations. Speak to us a little bit about this, because I think that, all of these folks that you chronicle in the book and these relationships that you've had, this is kind of a moving target also a little bit, but
people change. Like Evan Spiegel's good example, such a prick when I met him. Yeah. And I love productive, because I really like that product. I think it's a creative and interesting product. He's made mistakes, but boy, he's really good at product. He just is. It's a really good product. No one can deny that. And everyone else copies it. So that's how but he's not a brick anymore. I mean, he maybe sometimes, I guess, but he really isn't. Some people, are real pricks. And I would say Gates was one of those, kind of a jerk. I think he's a long reputation jerk. Somewhat productive. Yes, definitely. But Satya Nadella, not a prick at all, actually. There's not even a trace of it in him. And it's highly productive at Microsoft, right? What he's done, taken that company, he's sort of the Tim Cook of the same thing. Tim Cook, not a prick. Not a very productive in a different way than Steve Jobs was. Steve Jobs could be a bit of a prick, right? But by today's standards, not at all. Like his number drops rather significantly. Yeah. Elon has messed up my whole chart now, because he's like, so everyone else is like, if you're grading on a scale, everyone else drops and he goes up.
Yeah. So it's interesting. And again, not to.
But he's very productive.
Yeah. And I guess Jobs was one of the good examples that you used, is that, let's just say you could line up it was an 8 to 10 sort of situation, prick to productivity. And, Elon had that sort of set up too a few years ago, but things have changed there a little bit. One thing I thought was really interesting, because I was at your last Code conference, and that panel that you did with Lorraine Powell Jobs and Johnny Ive, and it was about as legendary as actually the panel that you did with Jobs and Gates, and you and Walt, back in the day. I actually loved it. I think it was one of the final.
Were you there for that?
Yes, I was. It was one of the final interviews of that. But
were you there for the Jobs Gates one?
Oh no, man. I was on a trading desk, and that I think was streaming back then. So you guys were early in streaming those sorts of things. It was one of those things where Wall Street literally stopped, Kara, and was watching that, because it had massive implications. But
it did.
Going back to the Lorraine Powell Jobs, that one. You said that you think that Jobs would have hated the Elon Musk, you know what I mean, that exists today. Not
the gang.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And I think that's interesting in a way, because I don't really remember Steve Jobs having too many opinions on too many things. So talk to us a little bit about how we remember him now in a sort of romantic sort of fashion, and what sort of social warrior he was back in the day, because I don't really remember him having too many opinions on too many political things back then.
He did have them. He just kept them to himself. And he wasn't, he did, one of the things that was interesting, if you go, I just got a book of letters between him and when people wrote him, he often wrote back, right? Mm-hmm. When people wrote him letters at Apple. And some of them were like someone's like, I don't like what you did to whatever dongle he took off. And he's like, I don't really care if you like it. I did it and I don't care. Don't buy my product. Like he would write, which I kind of do that too. Sometimes someone write, I don't like what you did here. I'm like, well, too bad. Here's why I did it. Don't listen if you don't like it. I don't know what to tell you. It's my my carousel. And if you don't like the horse I chose, don't ride it. He had a lot of opinions, and he did actually say, I have gone back and listened to a lot of those interviews, and boy, there are gems in there about podcasting early on, about privacy, about media, about television and streaming. This is pre any of it. So he was thinking really strongly about these things. He just didn't, and he also was very influential. He spent a lot of time talking to Rupert Murdoch. People don't realize that. They spent a lot of time because he wanted to shift him from where Rupert was going with the misinformation. And I'm not saying he was like Superman, but he saw the problems of misinformation long before other people did. He saw the problems of social media. He and I had many discussions about social media. He just didn't feel the need to tweet them. The other thing he didn't feel the need to do is tweet everything he did all day as a person, right? He didn't have an opinion on, and Tim Cook is the same way. You don't know what Tim Cook thinks of Ukraine, nor should you. Like he just, and I bet he knows a lot more than everybody else because around the world, Tim Cook probably knows more about foreign policy than most CEOs, given the worldwide global footprint of Apple. They just didn't. What I try to separate them from is adults versus toddlers. And again, that's an insult to toddlers because I have one, and he's a little bit out of control these days. But I want, give me, I say, I must yell, that kind of stuff. And they have no sense of it. But at least with a toddler, you can do something about it. With adult toddlers, there's nothing to be done because they just won't stop, and they have unlimited funds. And so I would separate adults from toddlers, and I mean that in the bad toddler behavior kind of thing. And Jobs you would not have known what he thought of Joe Biden. You would not know what he thought of the woke mind virus. He might have actually thought maybe there needs to be more back and forth. He liked back and forth quite a bit. I doubt he would have dunked on people. He would do that in interpersonal relationships, that's for sure. But I don't think he would have been a public. He wasn't was he a narcissist? I guess they all are, on some level. But I don't think he needed any constant affirmation and attention from people in order to wake up every morning. People you never met. He didn't need the fan base at all, or he was a secure person with his own. He liked himself, I think, quite a bit. So.
All right. So, Kara, on that front, okay, Sam Altman, you're getting to know him. You talk a little bit about him. One of the things I think
I've known him since he was 19.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is interesting about this book is it just came out this week, but you are actually, there's stuff in there that is really relevant right up into the moment with some of these players. So one of the things that I really kind of would love to get your take on is that the acceleration in the wealth and power of these folks who are running these companies. And the situation with Sam Altman is really interesting to me because, obviously you talk a little bit about him being ousted and coming back. And, there was a time where becoming a 100 millionaire was like a huge thing, and then becoming a billionaire and then 100 billionaire. One of these people that you mention in this book is likely to be the first trillionaire. And when you think about that, I'm just curious, can you put some context on the power and they will be unregulated? And you think about the situation with Elon and Starlink and in Ukraine and everything like that. There's a whole host of scenarios that we could all kind of just guess about where these people are going to be like, take the last 10 Bond villains, wrap them up into one, and they're more powerful. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I worry about unaccountable power by the richest people in the world, who some of whom have a victim complex, right? Oh no, they think they're one of my favorite things is, when I watch a lot of these tweets and stuff like that, it's so revelatory. They don't even realize how ridiculous they sound, and they're giving you so much information about themselves that they don't recognize. And what a lot of them are like, if you read them in general, it's like, let's get the man. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the man is out to get you. And I'm like, you're the man. You're the fucking man. You're the man. You're the only man. Like, you're the richest man. You're the most powerful man. And that makes me fascinated. I have always been worried, if you're any kind of student of history, about unaccountable power with unlimited funds. That to me is and unlimited real power to really affect people, whether it's Ukraine or through communications or anything else. I was worried when broadcast networks were owned by a small group of people. Now, oh no, like now with AGI, the expenses, that's why Sam Altman's raising, he needs $7 trillion, right? So if only the big people can compete here, that's really problematic for innovation, small companies, governments. These are nation states. If you don't realize that now, and they're nation states, some of whom have no experience and their goal is to make money. Oh no, the government's goal is not to make money. Barack Obama said this, the government's goal is not to make money. It's something else. It's about democracy. So I worry a great deal about democracy in that kind of situation because they have all the levers and none of the responsibility. So.
Talk to me a little bit about how you want to compare the optimists about the internet and how it's going to transform almost every sort of industry and how we interact with each other in the late 90s. And we know that like the air came out of that bubble. And I'm not just talking about from an investment standpoint, but in the early 2000s, but then it just reinflated in a big, big way. And, you know, the convergence of broadband and social and mobile and all that sort of stuff. And now here we are, you know, 25 years later, and people are saying the same things about generative AI that they were saying about. So let's talk about that a little bit. And what does that remind you of?
Well, they're warning a little bit. Like you notice with everyone, every time Sam Altman gets up, he's like, oh, the great things, cancer, cancer, cancer will be solved. And by the way, killer robots. Like he does at least mention the killer robots in the, or whatever he happens to say. Every speech he gives, I'm watching, Sam and I are going to do an event in San Francisco. He's very deft in that he doesn't pretend there aren't downfalls. And he's actually reaching out to politicians. So he has for those who don't like him, plausible deniability. For those who do, it's responsible, right? I think it's somewhere in between, right? He needs to say the bad things. And I'm just using him as an example. You know, I really was super offended by Mark Andreessen's, who's now like in Washington all the time because he wants crypto not to be deregulated, essentially. You know, his techno optimism, like either you're for us or against us. What a stupid argument. Like what? Like either for us or against us? Really? That sounds familiar. Who is like that? Who says things? There's no such thing as for us or against us. I believe in the good part of technology, but I also believe in the dangers of technology. Any intelligent adult would do that. Everyone else that says it's all great or it's all terrible, I don't have any time for them. I don't believe in accelerationists. I don't believe in decelerations. I believe in smart people go, all right, we got an electric vehicle. For example, you can just take it away from this. This is why it's good. Humans kill more people. Electric vehicles have a better safety record. That said, oops, they can run over people and something doesn't happen. It probably will happen only once, and it'll happen hundreds of thousands of times with people. What can we do to mitigate that? There's always going to be, with any technology, and I have that Paul Virilio quote, there's a shipwreck, there's electricity, there's electrocution. You have to be able to do that. And I think any intelligent person with AGI has to understand we need guardrails and regulation on a global basis. And one of the things I do a lot, I happened to be at a dinner the other night and I look over and it's Tony friggin' Blinken. And I'm like, oh, look, I have a chance. And he asked me, he goes, what about AGI? I go, listen, Tony, you got to get a global thing together. You got to do this. You got to do this. I said, you don't understand. It's a global thing. And I just like, literally, I was like, here's my chance. If anyone's going to do something, whoever I meet, I'm like, we have to have a global, like just like nuclear cloning. We have done this before. What are the good things and what are the bad things? And I really thought the Biden executive order was quite good on that. I thought it was like, here's what we do to preserve research and innovation. Here's what we do to guard around safety. Here's what could happen. But that's just an executive order. I want Congress to act.
Georgetown University, I mean, they save certain places for certain people. So Gaston Hall, for those who can go to their Google machine and check it out. I mean, that's typically reserved for Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Brad Cooper.
Mark Zuckerberg was there.
Mark Zucker. You're playing Gaston Hall in a couple weeks. I mean, do you ever
I'm
just
playing there? Gonna sing and a dance.
And say, holy shit, I can't believe that I'm doing this.
I do not, because I was very, it's interesting on this book tour. I don't like book tours. I don't. This is another reason. I'm like, oh God, book tours. And I have this terrible memory of going to one bookstore, my first book, and like, nobody shows up. Right? Like that kind of thing. And so I thought, I'm going to make this interesting. And so what I did is I asked, since I'm good at doing events, I've managed to get a lot of people to talk to me over the years. Why don't I flip the tables and they can ask me questions, right? And so in every venue I got in San Francisco, I'm doing an event with Sam Altman. I'm doing an event with Reid Hoffman. In Seattle, I think I have Alex Stamos asking because I've given him a hard enough time over the years. In LA, Bob Iger. I can't announce one of them in Boston, but it's a pretty prominent person. It's a very prominent person. In DC, I have Lorraine Powell Jobs. In New York, I have Don Lemon. We have a lot of beefs over Twitter, so it's great. Let's just have them out. They are in New York at the 92nd Street Y. And so I thought it was really important to have Steve Case at one of them. And so he loves to give me a hard time. And I'm like, here's your chance, finally. And so I'm creating, what I wanted to do there is it's less about me and my book than let's have a real interesting discussion with the principals. In Austin, it's Mark Cuban, for example. Perfect, right? He's in Austin. And so I want to create I'm going to create really interesting discussion events. And I forget, the last one is Mary Barra is in Detroit, in Ann Arbor. With her, we'll talk probably about EVs. With Sam, we'll talk about AI probably. With Don, it'll be Twitter. With Mark, it'll be healthcare. With Bob, it'll be entertainment. And Lorraine will probably be wealth and philanthropy and the legacy of Steve Jobs. And so, no, I don't pinch myself because I'm making a really good product, right, for the audience and not for me, essentially. And it'll be good. Should be good, right?
It is good. Kara, well, listen, we're going to move some books here. You guys heard what our offer is. So make sure you do the thing, leave the review, you get the book. And Kara, we appreciate.
What are you making them do? What are you
They're just going to leave a review for the OK Computer Pod. And
good. Nice.
And
I like
they
this.
send it to Amanda and she sends them a book. So the first 100 people who do that. So listen, I love the book.
It's a good book.
It's a great book. And it really is something that I think is very instructive also for the period that we're in right now. I think a lot of folks who are trying to figure out this kind of new techno age we're in, I think they're going to learn a lot about your experience in the front row seat that you had reporting on it and reporting on these people and reporting on the technologies and how the booms and the busts and everything in between. So Kara, Guy and I really appreciate you coming back to the pod.
Can I say one more quick thing? Is one of the things that drives me crazy, one of the things I did on the back of the book was, instead of blowing insults of me by some of these tech people and some praise. And the reason I did that, and one of them is like, Elon, you're an asshole, Elon Musk, which is perfect. But one of the things that I think has happened too much is there's a need to either hate it or love it. Right. And I don't understand that. Our country has become so not just polarized, but reductive in a way that's stupid. It's just stupid to think one way or the other. And I would assume the mark of a really good investor is to assess both sides, right? And I think that's what the book does well. I think you cannot come away with it. I have this thing on Kara's mean to tech people. You can't read this and think I'm mean to tech people. You think I can be tough on them and fair, but I hope that's what people get out of it.
100%. That's what we got out of it. We really appreciate it. We hope that our listeners and our viewers get this book, read this book, and we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear what you have to say, because we don't think Kara's mean, do we, Guy?
I love Kara Swisher. I've been a fan of Kara. No, I mean that. Listen, before I even met her, and I admire you a great deal. So I have nothing but the highest praise, Kara. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, guys.